Hi, I'm David Levine. I'm co-chair of Science Writers in New York. My guest tonight is Dr. David Oshinsky. He's director of the Division of Medical Humanities at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. He's a professor in the NYU Department of History. In 2009, PBS's The American Experience aired The Polio Crusade, a documentary based on his book, An American Story, Polio, An American Story. And in 2020, released McCarthy, Power Feeds on Fear, a documentary based on his biography of Joseph McCarthy. So what are some of the parallels between the polio vaccine and COVID vaccine? And give us a little history about the Cutter Institute and also Cutter incident, and also when you think human vaccine resistance really started.
Okay, David, let me start even a little earlier than that. Okay, I grew up in an era when there were no vaccines. The first vaccine, the Salk vaccine, doesn't come into play until 1954. So I was part of the baby boom. And polio would come every year like the plague. It was a summer disease. You would look at the New York City newspapers, you'd see what looked like baseball box scores, but they were really talking about the number of kids in polio wards throughout the city. And the numbers would sort of begin to rise around Memorial Day, get higher in June, higher in July, kind of peak in August. And then around Labor Day, they would start to go down. During that time, they would close swimming pools and beaches all around New York City because they believed that polio was transmitted through the water. I had to stay out of crowds, meaning that you couldn't go to the movies, you couldn't go bowling, you had to rest, all things kids didn't want to do, but we had to. My mother would give me a polio test a couple times a week. Could I touch my toes? Could I put my chin to my chest? And, and the slightest sense of stiffness, muscle stiffness, or a sore throat, would send a parent into a panic. And then you'd sort of come back in September, school would start, and you would see kids in wheelchairs, kids on crutches, and the occasional empty chair of the child who had died of polio. And you realized that you had dodged the bullet for that summer, but you knew that the next summer, polio was coming back. The virus was coming back. And I wrote about it because the experience, I think, was very, very powerful for me and others who lived through that generation. And with the day it was announced that the Salk vaccine was successful, the first vaccine, the killed virus and activated virus vaccine, the country celebrated. It was a national celebration. Jonas Salk was invited to the White House, and for the first time in anyone's memory, President Eisenhower really broke down in tears as he thanked Salk for saving the children of the world. So it was absolutely remarkable moment. And at some point in the discussion or the conversation we're having, we can also talk about the power of science in that era. It was the feeling that science could conquer all, which has almost been reversed in terms of trust at this point.
So I know in the 1950s, polio hit children very hard. But there was a different way before that, where Franklin Roosevelt ended up in a wheelchair. It was hitting adults.
Exactly.
And people ended up in iron lungs.
Yes, iron lung was the worst. That was bulbar polio. That's when basically the muscles in your diaphragm didn't work, and you had to have a machine that would breathe for you. And that was really, really serious. Most of the people, the children who died of bulbar polio and were in iron lungs. FDR was kind of an anomaly. He was a member of a big, important aristocratic family. He was 6'2", strapping, handsome, 39 years old, and he comes down with a disease called infantile paralysis. And I remember, David, very well that when I was writing the book on polio, my editor said to me, "Why did Roosevelt get polio?" And I said, "He was unlucky." And I remember she said, "That's not good enough. You've got to give us a better reason than that." And what I did was to kind of go back to the obvious. Roosevelt had been raised basically without other children around on a big estate in the Hudson Valley with tutors. And when he went and finally went to Groton and Harvard, Columbia Law School and the like, his life became like a medical encyclopedia. He came down with every disease known to humankind and almost died in the of pneumonia in the great influenza of 1918. So you can probably make the case that growing up in this environmental bubble was about the worst thing that could have happened to FDR. And then, to make it very, very brief, FDR had run for vice president of the United States in 1920. He had lost. It wasn't a Democratic year, wouldn't be a Democratic decade. But he had been a really good candidate, and the Republicans were looking to trash him. And what they did was to invite him down to Washington in the midst, he was 39 years old, 1921, in the midst of an enormous heat wave. And for 4 days, they grilled him before Congress on a bogus issue involving homosexuality in the Navy, because FDR had been an assistant secretary of the Navy during World War I. After being grilled like this, and I assume maybe his immune system was compromised, he then went to his ancestral home before going to Campobello Island, where he had a summer home. And when he went to his home in the Hudson Valley in Hyde Park, he attended a Boy Scout jamboree. And the last photograph we have of Roosevelt walking unassisted was with his arms around a group of young boys. He then went up to Campobello Island, engaged in frenetic physical activity, fell into the Bay of Fundy off his boat, said he had never felt water that cold, spent that afternoon in a wet bathing suit doing correspondence, went to bed that night not feeling well, and woke up with a full-blown case of polio that almost killed him. And I think if you look at that time chart, it's possible to make some sort of guess at an explanation for why a 39-year-old man would get a disease that wasn't prevalent in the United States at this time and extremely rare among adults. What is most important, of course, is that FDR then started the March of Dimes, really the greatest charity that the United States has ever seen. And it was through the March of Dimes that these two vaccines were brought to fruition, the Sabin and the Salk.
So in the 1950s, it was killing and paralyzing close to 50,000 people, I guess mostly children.
Yes, mostly children. It was a childhood disease, although the ages kept growing, getting slightly older. You know, it was 12-year-olds and 14 and 20, 21, but most of them was sort of 3 to 7. And one of the interesting things about this, David, is that polio in epidemic form was a disease of the West in the 20th century. It had been around for many, many centuries, but it had always been endemic. You know, a couple cases here, a couple cases there. But the major epidemics occurred in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. And we don't have any set answer as to why that happened. But the best guess is that polio, to some degree, is a disease of cleanliness, meaning that the more antiseptic society became in terms of clean water, all kinds of antiseptics, wiping down tables, et cetera, et cetera. Children were less likely to come into contact with poliovirus when they had protective maternal antibodies or when the disease itself was less virulent. So what you would have is a kid who had no exposure to polio at all in the United States until he was, say, 4 or 5, and a polio epidemic hit his town. And that is really the best explanation we have. It's very unusual. I mean, it's still endemic in small parts of Pakistan and Nigeria and the like, but those areas never had a major polio epidemic. It was only in the West in the modern era.
There's a great book by Philip Roth about it. I think it's called Nemesis.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Where he talks about how this hysteria that if a shopkeeper got it, people blamed the shop, or they blamed a cat, and they would send kids to the Jersey Shore with the theory that fresh air would be a good thing for them.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I remember my parents were both teachers in New York City, not making much money, but we always went to the mountains in the summer as a way partly of escaping polio, when in fact, it didn't make any difference. You were as vulnerable to polio at Lake George as you were to polio in Queens.
Okay, so Hawk is a hero to people, right? I mean, Larry David has a routine about imagining what Jonas Salk's mother talking about, yelling out from the Bronx, "Do you hear what my son did?" And so we have, the difference between, Jonas Salk's reception at the White House and the Dr. Fauci's and the others.
It's day and night. It's
Yeah.
absolutely day and night.
And I guess my puzzlement is that, Donald Trump, he created Operation Warp Speed.
He did.
It was successful.
It was.
And yet the people who are, most of the anti-vaxxers are on the right.
I'll talk about that in a little bit. I will talk about that. To me, I think when you picture the 1950s, this was the high point of faith in science and faith in your doctor. What your doctor said was the gospel. Antibiotics were rolling off the assembly lines. Vaccines were now, the polio vaccine came first, and then measles, mumps, rubella, one after the other. And there was really a sense that infectious disease was not only on the run, but was going to become irrelevant. If you look at medical textbooks and journals in the 1950s, they're actually telling medical students not to go into infectious disease, to go into chronic diseases, that infectious disease is a thing of the past, and we have it under control. And you look at our arrogance when you look at what has happened since then in terms of HIV, AIDS, Ebola, Zika, Marburg, MERS, SARS, and now this. It's nature's always one step ahead, basically.
So let's say that scientists today were celebrated as in the 1950s, and the belief in science was just as great. I mean, I remember polls that even as like 10 or 15 years ago, that scientists were always among the most trusted people.
Right, and physicians.
And physicians.
Yes.
And now that's not true.
That has been undermined. I think, let me give you my historical analysis. I think that something happened in the 1960s and 70s that really made Americans increasingly suspicious of elites. I think the Vietnam War played a role where people just were no longer believing what the government was telling them. I think Watergate played a role where people realized that politics could not be dirtier and untruthful. And I think that also what happened at that time was you began to have sort of rogue scientists like Andrew Wakefield, for example, who began publishing bogus studies claiming, for example, that the MMR vaccine triggered autism. And for parents who had children with autism, they finally began to see an explanation for what was wrong with their children. And what really happened, David, and I think it's interesting, is that just about the time we had the coming of COVID, the anti-vaccine movement was kind of in a change. It was moving in a certain direction. The earlier direction had been that vaccines are dangerous. What really began to occur around COVID was a kind of switch to it's my choice, it's freedom of choice. The government has no right to tell me what to do with my body. If I think vaccines are dangerous or they shouldn't be put in my body, that should be my choice. And that has, I think, become, in some ways, the real issue separating those who believe in vaccines and those who do not. There is still in the middle a very large group of people I would call vaccine hesitant. These are people who could, I think, be convinced with the right arguments and the right people to become vaccinated. But there is a growing group of anti-vaxxers who are just saying, screw the government, I'm going to do what I want. I don't care about what you think about herd immunity. This is my choice. And if I don't want to get a vaccine, damn the government, I'm not getting a vaccine.
I think one striking difference was that the people who were against the MMR vaccines were very often on the left.
Yes, yes, you're absolutely right. You are absolutely right. I grew up, or I certainly came of age in an era where it was sort of young, hippie, holistic medicine, natural foods, and they tended to be the first wave of the anti-vaccine movement, the modern anti-vaccine movement. You're absolutely correct.
Right, and there's also the theory that children are getting too many vaccines.
Oh yes, that is, and if we have any pediatricians who are here in this discussion, that has become one of the key issues. You get a lot of parents now who are saying, I'm not anti-vaccine, but my kids are getting too many at once. Now, the American Pediatric Association and have done endless studies showing that this is the perfect, basically, way to do it. This is the way you space out vaccines, because the longer a kid is unvaccinated, the more likely the kid is to come down with that particular disease. And some of these diseases are much more virulent when the kid is 17 as when the kid is 5. So the schedule is there for a reason, but what you're finding are increasing numbers of pediatricians who are giving in, even though they know the science is wrong. They are giving in to parents because they don't want to lose the child. And that, I think, is a real dilemma for pediatricians today.
So I read recently that that there are studies showing that the initial COVID vaccines should have been spaced out differently. Instead of 3 weeks after Pfizer and 4 weeks after Moderna, that it's better to do what England did, like 5 months later. And so that traditionally vaccines are not given Like hepatitis vaccines are not giving 3 weeks later. It's like,
Right. Well, you know, what you have to understand, David, is that we were in a really unique situation here. We were doing science on the fly. The whole concept of Operation Warp Speed was to do this as quickly as possible, which I think alarmed certain people. But in other words, to get this out as quickly as possible. We're not going to cut any serious corners, but we really have to do this as fast as we can. So a lot of this was trial and error. It was day by day. Moderna's vaccine had twice the vaccine dose that Pfizer vaccine had, because they both were using the best evidence they had from previous studies, and Pfizer's turned out to be a much stronger vaccine, which is one of the reasons that Pfizer cut its booster dose in half. So there was so much that was unknown, particularly with mRNA vaccines, that you just had to go with the best evidence you had.
so I've heard you talk and I've read about Qatar Laboratories, which released a vaccine so contaminated with the live polio virus that 164 children were permanently paralyzed and 10 died.
Right.
And I was thinking, if that had happened with a COVID vaccine,
Oh my God.
I think that.
Yeah. Well, you know,
I mean, Johnson & Johnson has stopped making their vaccine.
I know for a very short period of time, for a heart issue that was infinitesimally small, nothing like what happened. I'll describe Qatar, which was probably the worst disaster in the history of vaccines in the United States. Jonas Salk in 1954 ran the biggest study in American history, the biggest phase 3 testing in American history. They lined up more than 1 million school children whose parents gave consent. No one was certain how well this vaccine worked or how safe it was. Jonas Salk was perfectly confident. He said, my vaccine works, my vaccine is safe. I've tested it on monkeys, on chimpanzees, and on small groups of children around the Pittsburgh area, and it works. And what Jonas Salk wanted to do, David, and this is interesting, he was against the way the major study of more than 1 million kids was set up, which had a certain group of kids getting 3 shots of the real vaccine, a certain group of kids getting 3 shots of a look-alike placebo, and then a certain percentage of kids just being observed controls. Salk thought this was unconscionable in the middle of polio season. Why not give the vaccine to everyone and then check it against the population as a whole? But the March of Dimes said this had to pass scientific muster, so they basically split it up. And what Salk found, the people who studied the results of the vaccine found, was that the kids who got the real vaccine had far fewer cases of polio than the kids who got the look-alike placebo. It was dramatic. And once that became public knowledge in one of the wildest press conferences you will ever see, every parent in America wanted that vaccine for his or her kid. I mean, it worked, it's here. We've been fighting polio for 25 years. It's a children's disease, the most innocent of victims. I want my kid to get it. So what happened was that with Salk's huge 1 million plus testing, he tested that vaccine in his own lab. He tested it in the lab of the 2 vaccine makers who had to follow specifically his instructions, and also a very small group in Washington, in the Federal Drug Administration, ran some trials on these vaccines as well. So it was triple tested. It worked great. It worked great. There was almost no instance we could find of vaccine-induced polio. What happens then is that once it's successful, they just pour out the vaccine to a desperate country.
Was it free?
It was free. Yes, the vaccine. It wouldn't be after this, but yes, the vaccine originally was free. It was handed out by the government through these 6 or 7 vaccine makers. A number of the vaccine makers had trouble with Salk's formula. And Salk's formula was vital because this is in an inactivated vaccine, meaning that there are 3 basic types of poliovirus. And one of the types, type 1, the Mahoney virus, was extremely virulent. So you damn well had to kill that to inactivate it completely. And one of the companies, Cutter Laboratories of Berkeley, California, began producing the Salk vaccine, which contained a lot of live virus in it. In other words, it hadn't effectively inactivated that vaccine, and that vaccine went out. And Cutter made disastrous mistakes and basically hid them. And within a period of about 2 or 3 weeks, Cutter was in Berkeley, California. Kids all up and down the West Coast were coming down with vaccine-induced polio from the vaccine itself. And really one of the great and largely unknown stories is the very young CDC, which had been set up just a few years before, had a team of crack epidemiologists, and they went out to California and they looked at what was going on at Cutter and realized there was a lot of live vaccine in its supposedly inactivated vaccine, and they stopped all, and they recalled every case of the Cutter vaccine. Cutter basically closed down after that. But it was too late, as you mentioned, because thousands of kids had serious muscle weakness. As you mentioned, about close to 200 were paralyzed, and I think 10 to 12 actually died from the vaccine. What the government did was to stop the entire vaccine rollout until it knew what was going on. And then once it found out that Cutter was the violator, it closed that down, but allowed the other companies to keep producing the vaccine. And we have not had in the United States a single case of vaccine-induced polio from Salk's killed virus inactivated vaccine. So it's a
what about the Sabin vaccine?
Well, the Sabin vaccine is a live virus attenuated weakened vaccine.
Right. Because I believe my children got that.
Yeah, anything after 62, 63.
And they told us that when we change a diaper to wash our hands afterwards.
Yes. Okay. And they're absolutely correct, David. That is. So what happened is Sabin and Salk were bitter rivals. Most of it fell on Sabin's shoulders. He was really sharp-elbowed, and he was devastated that this younger physician, researcher, using an old technique, meaning the inactivated vaccine, had come out first when his vaccine, he was certain, as were most virologists, were certain that he had the better vaccine, that the live virus polio vaccine basically caused a mild case of polio in the gut, but not strong enough to make you ill, but strong enough to give you very, very strong immunity. It worked great. And I don't know how much time I have. I guess we got a little bit. So many kids had taken the Salk vaccine by the time Sabin's vaccine was ready, that Sabin had to go test in the Soviet Union. It was unbelievable. And this was no double-blind study. They just lined up 70 million kids, and every single one of them was vaccinated with Sabin's vaccine. And they came back, Sabin came back with astonishingly positive results. And Sabin's vaccine then pushed Salk's vaccine to the side. Sabin was very cruel about it, to put it mildly.
Okay, for those listening, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box.
Yeah.
And, you know,
Sure.
So let's now talk about.
I just want to say, David, one
Yeah.
more thing.
Okay.
So Sabin's vaccine, Salk's vaccine had brought the numbers down from about 40,000 a year to about 1,500. One of the problems was that it had to be given by injection. So it's much harder. You needed professionals and the like. The beauty of Sabin's vaccine, it was cheaper. You just put it on the kid's tongue. It went down through the digestive system and did its work. The one problem, and Sabin got the numbers down from 1,500 to about 15 a year in the United States. There was one problem with Sabin's vaccine. You could never get the number down to 0 because an infinitesimally small number of kids would get polio from the vaccine. The vaccine could revert to virulence. And that is one of the reasons, David, they told you to wash your hands, because the kid excreted some of that out. And if you yourself were unvaccinated, there was a minimal chance you could get the disease. So in the 1990s, the United States reversed itself, the CDC and the FDA and others, and went back to the Salk vaccine. So we in the United States today, and in most of the Western world, use Salk's inactivated vaccine. If we have any time later, we'll see that in the rest of the world, particularly the poorer parts of the world, Sabin's vaccine is used because it's cheaper and much, much easier to give.
Yeah, I know there's a fear of needles, but there's a picture of Elvis Presley getting the
Yes.
getting the needle, and they asked him to do it. You know, so yeah.
The March of Dimes was the most incredible charity. They were the ones who thought up celebrities taking the vaccine and pushing the vaccine. Elvis was one, Joe DiMaggio, Marilyn Monroe. They got everybody. They were the ones who thought up poster children. And they were the ones who kind of turned fundraising on its head. We don't want big contributions from the few. No one is too poor to give a dime to help a kid walk again. So they got millions of volunteers involved, like my mother. You couldn't go to the movies, you could go anywhere without someone asking you for a dime for polio. And the March of Dimes raised more money for a relatively modest disease in terms of other childhood diseases than every single charity put together, with the exception of the American Red Cross.
So why did a charity have the authority to tell, to set up a vaccine protocol saying that you couldn't just give it to everybody, you had to give it to?
Because the March of Dimes had a virology committee made up of the most important virologists in the United States. And they told him that if he did not run a double-blind study with controls, they were going to get somebody else to do it.
Okay. So we've had some questions in advance, and if there are questions now, put them. So first of all, was there vaccine reluctance in the Salk era? It seems parents were quite eager to have their kids vaccinated.
I'm sorry, say that again, David. I didn't quite get that.
I'm sorry. Was there vaccine resistance in the Salk era? It seems parents were very eager to have their kids vaccinated.
No, it was just the opposite. Try to think of more than 1 million parents pushing their kids into line for a vaccine that is largely unknown. It would be ridiculous to even think in those terms today. But parents, my parents, had a good sense of risk versus reward. And they saw what polio did every single year to children. And to them, that was far more dangerous than an experimental vaccine that might end this problem. Today, you have parents who've never seen polio. They don't even know what the hell it is. When I'm at Bellevue, most of the medical students and residents have barely heard of it. No one has seen a case of it, unless you've been to Pakistan or Afghanistan. So people say, well, why should I have my kid take any chance of getting a polio vaccine when there's no polio? And what you got to say to them is, if we get below herd immunity, the virus is still circulating out there. It's only a plane ride away.
Well, I was lucky enough to be born when the vaccine was close to being available, but I have friends whose older brothers and sisters had polio, and I would remember some of them have canes and leg braces. So it's something very visible. Unlike COVID, where people who are really ill you don't see them, they're in the hospitals.
That's a very good point. It's an extremely visual disease. What polio has in common with COVID is that the vast majority of polio cases and COVID cases are asymptomatic, meaning that they're silent carriers. And because they're silent carriers, you basically have to vaccinate everybody. Smallpox is the only disease ever to be wiped off the face of the earth. And one of the reasons it was easier was that you show symptoms immediately and they're completely obvious, so that you can use surveillance and containment to control outbreaks. You don't have to vaccinate someone 300 miles away. And it was much easier. Also, there are differences. I mean, the polio virus, there are 3 strains. They're very sturdy. They're not a whole lot, they don't vary. So if you can pack those 3 strains into the polio vaccine, you're going to pretty much prevent polio in that child. And one of the strains has been wiped out completely.
So there are cases of people who are getting COVID, even though they've had the first 2 doses. They've also had booster shots, and that is very dissimilar to polio.
Correct. That is correct. The odds of getting polio after getting your polio shot are, 1 in I don't know how many thousands. It's just, it really works. The vaccine really works. And the odds of getting polio a second time are also, incredibly small, which makes it different. What also makes different, David, is that it's got different victims. I mean, COVID, it's older people and, people with various issues, health issues, and polio was children, healthy children. So there are differences and similarities. And the other is polio should be easier, as smallpox was, because there's no animal host. In other words, COVID has animal hosts, and that's always a problem. But smallpox and polio do not. They're completely human diseases.
But one thing about polio is that there are people, as they get older in their 70s, they get post-polio syndrome.
They do.
Yeah.
It's one of the problems with post-polio syndrome is that we really haven't studied it much. The reason being that the people who've got polio, virtually no one's had it since the 1960s. So these people are dying out. There are fewer and fewer people who have the disease every single year. What we do think we know is that it's not the virus hiding somewhere in the body and then coming back. What it is people who've relied on certain muscles. Those muscles have just worn out. Basically, if you can't use your legs, you find other muscles in your arms and shoulders and the like to use. And those, it's like a car with too many miles on it, really.
So here's a question. Polio is a virus. Did it ever mutate?
No, very rarely. There are extremely minor mutations which can occur when you get the oral polio vaccine, the Sabin vaccine. But it's, you're talking it's one, I think, per every 2.7 million people who get the vaccine. Okay, so that is not an issue. And one of the beauty of the polio vaccines, unlike the influenza vaccine, where you don't know what you're packing into the vaccine is the virus that is most virulent out there. You're taking the best guess you can. Polio doesn't have that issue. Smallpox didn't have that issue. Very stable viruses.
So with the Sabin vaccine, how many doses were there? I mean, was there a
that's interesting. Generally, it could be as many as 4 doses for the Sabin. But if you go to areas in the poorest parts of India or Pakistan or Nigeria or Afghanistan, and the water is really bad and the conditions are, in terms of health, are very poor, you may have to vaccinate that kid 8, 9, 10 times.
Okay. But in general, in the United States, I remember having a polio vaccine on a sugar cube, and then I think I had 1 booster or 2 boosters. I don't remember.
Yeah. I'm how old are you, David? May I ask?
Yeah. So I just turned 70.
So you were born in
51.
You probably got the Salk vaccine, the injected Salk vaccine. I doubt they would have waited until you were 10, 11 years old to vaccinate you, because that's when the Sabin vaccine.
I remember getting a sugar cube vaccine though.
You remember getting a shot?
No, the sugar cube. I do remember that.
And it may be a number of kids got both.
Yeah.
They got the Salk vaccine and then the Sabin vaccine. So I can't imagine that they waited till you were 10 or 11 to give you the Salk vaccine.
No,
I don't know.
I had Jewish parents. I'm sure they
Yeah, exactly.
So
exactly.
But I definitely do remember going to and I actually when we moved to New York, and I was probably about 11, getting the sugar vaccine.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is that we are really close to eradicating polio, to stopping all wild virus circulation of polio. The numbers, we haven't had a case in the United States in decades, in the Western Hemisphere in decades, because we have herd immunity, we vaccinate. The only place wild virus is circulating are generally in areas where there are bloodbath revolutions going on, where there's religious fundamentalism, like that in Afghanistan and the like, that kill vaccinators who come out into the field, or there's the Boko Haram in Nigeria. And there is heavy vaccine resistance there. So that has to be overcome. And we have the numbers down now under 100 a year. But the question is, will we get to the final case?
So somebody said, I remember getting both shots at the doctor's office and sugar cubes in school with the whole neighborhood. And
well, then that person does never have to worry about getting polio. That person is fully vaccinated, which is great.
And he asked, doesn't polio infect other primates in the wild?
No, it doesn't. What you can do is you can take a chimpanzee and shoot polio virus into his brain, and he'll come down with a case of polio. But there is no way one animal gives it to another. There's no host that you can force it into an animal, but there's really no host.
Okay, so let's go. I want to talk about the vaccine resistance.
Yeah.
And let's say that we were in the 1950s and the COVID vaccine came out and everybody got it. No, there was no resistance to it. Would COVID be wiped out?
I think that Omicron would be wiped out. What would come next? I mean, one of the problems is that there appear to be consistent variants. And what that means, unfortunately, is that COVID could become endemic like influenza. It could be that we're going to need a booster shot every year. But what you can bank on in the 1950s is that there would have been very little resistance to that concept. And that is one of the beauties of that particular era. You had antibiotics pouring out now, which took care of bacterial infections, and you had all kinds of vaccines taking care of viral infections.
So I guess there was the paradox that the vaccine was formulated under the Trump administration. Only recently has he taken pride in that. And most of the vaccine hesitancy for COVID, as opposed to MMR, seems to be on the right.
That is correct.
And there's also, people are saying that, I have a cousin who won't get it, and he's saying that the vaccines have poisons in them. I've heard, that Bill Gates invented the vaccine, which he didn't.
Yeah.
And microchips. So why isn't the people who developed the vaccine, why are they promoting vaccine, vaccine hesitancy? What is the gain of vaccine hesitancy?
Well, I think the gain of vaccine hesitancy for Fox News, for example, is that they kind of rally the base against the Biden administration, against the FDA and the NIH, and it's based on the fact that scientists, according to them, know nothing. They're hardly experts on this, and that they are denying them the freedom of employment, the freedom to go about their business. And, it's become an extremely powerful movement. The paradox, David, as you've mentioned, is that, like it or not, it's largely Trump's vaccine. He wasn't a big fan of Operation Warp Speed at the beginning. But once he fully understood the mess that he was in, and the only way of getting out of it before the election was a vaccine, he then became a very strong supporter of the vaccine. And the one thing I will say to Trump's credit is everyone sees him as a longtime anti-vaxxer. And that is true. Even in 2016, when he ran for office, he was always making connections between autism and vaccination. When Trump got into office, one of the first things that happened is that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., sort of the leading anti-vax, I won't go any further, I don't want to be sued, but the leading anti-vax extremist, let's call him an extremist, actually visited Trump Tower and came down and held a press conference in which he said, the president's going to appoint me to have a commission on vaccine safety. And we thought, oh my God, this can't be true. What happened very quickly was that Trump's team talked him out of it. And as president, Trump began to move away from these people. He got a flu shot every single year. It's what presidents should do, but there's no requirement. And when there were big measles outbreaks in California and the like, Trump basically pushed vaccination. So he was sort of a different person as president, which made it much easier for him to back Operation Warp Speed. And, we can argue this forever. I argue it with my friends, but it's possible the Biden administration made a mistake by not giving Trump his due for Operation Warp Speed. They immediately changed the name. They didn't want them doing any public service announcements. I can understand that. It was so bitter after January 6th, God knows. But in the early days, Trump was very proud of that vaccine and was more than happy to take full credit for it. And even now, he will tell audiences, even though some of them boo him, that he has gotten both shots and a booster, and it's a good idea. That's as far as he will go. He will not say, I think you all should get it, but he will willingly admit that.
Well, there are people who say they don't oppose vaccines, but they oppose mandates.
Correct.
Yeah, so,
Correct.
so let's get to some questions.
Sure.
It's been noted that COVID has affected African Americans more seriously than it has affected white people. Was that also true of polio?
No, it was not true of polio. The Salk vaccine was given to all children. Now, the March of Dimes was not going to, go against segregation laws in the South. That wasn't what they were about. So did kids get the vaccine in segregated facilities? Absolutely, but they both got the vaccine. No one was denied that vaccine. And what we are finding now, even in the case of African Americans, is that the numbers of African Americans getting vaccinated is now pretty much approaching the number of Caucasians getting vaccinated, because there have been so many deaths and serious cases in the African American and the Black communities.
Someone says, I keep asking myself, if this were like bubonic plague with people dropping dead in the street in front of us, would we still have such vaccine hesitancy? I read that there was resistance to masking in the midst of the flu pandemic of 1918. Is the emotional impetus for anti-vaxxers the same as that?
It's a very good question. We had always ignored the 1918 epidemic, even though it killed more people in a shorter time than any event in human history. But it sort of went into this dark hole and nobody thought about it. Now it's kind of coming back since we have COVID. What we know is, obviously they didn't even barely know what a virus was at this time, and antibiotics don't work, and there were no antibiotics then. So they basically, the only thing they could do was to have non-therapeutic measures like no parades, no crowding, spacing out work times, so you didn't have millions of people on the subway at the same time, stuff like that. And a major study done by the Journal of the American Medical Association about 12 years ago showed, and this I think is really interesting, David, it showed that cities that took the epidemic most seriously, and by that I mean they started masking, they closed schools, they staggered business hours, they basically did what they could do to separate people. Those cities had many fewer deaths, but these are cities that had to put this into place, keep it going for as long as possible, wait till the pandemic basically ended. And those cities did, like some of the cities like Philadelphia did worse, because they were holding big bond rally parades and all kinds of stuff. So what this study showed is that non-pharmaceutical measures really worked in 1918, which is interesting.
That's something that Dr. Deborah Birx talked about. And she's a good historian. And she was, unfortunately, her reputation kind of got sullied, but
everyone's did.
She was a great HIV researcher, and
oh yeah, absolutely.
And she said that in the 1918 flu, that social distancing was very important.
It was. Yeah. It was very important. I mean, that is one of the weirdest pandemics, in that in the United States, every time the flu comes, it's the old and the young who hit the hardest. the 1918 influenza, the killing field was people 18 to 39. Those were the ones who were most at risk for that.
And also, it came and went to South America, then it came back to the United States.
It did.
Then at the end of World War I, there were all these celebrations, and that
right, and soldiers coming back.
And that became a super spreader event.
Exactly. That is exactly right. Yeah.
So someone says, is there any prospect for a sugar cube administered COVID vaccine? Could that cure hesitancy? I know they're looking at nasal vaccines.
Yeah, and then nasal vaccines, and also, a lot of companies are now getting involved with antivirals pills, which will help once you get the disease. I think at this point, and it's a really good question, I've gone from optimism to a kind of pessimism. I don't think a sugar cube will make. I mean, there are some people who don't like to get shots, but I don't think that's the major reason people are refusing these vaccines.
Okay, another question. What is the role of Evusheld, talking about the pills, going to be for the immunosuppressed? What is the evidence that will help people who can't make antibodies because of underlying illness or medications?
The answer is we don't know.
Okay.
The answer is absolutely we don't know. Antivirals have really worked. Look at, say, HIV. Antivirals have turned it from a killing field into a disease you can live with. We have no vaccine. There's no vaccine. We were promised one in 1987, but we're still looking for it. Antivirals could really play an enormous role as we move into the future. I think they could be, if vaccine hesitancy continues at this level, they could be a really important panacea. And David, let me say the other thing, that there's a huge part of the world that is unvaccinated, not because they're hesitant, but because there's no vaccine for them. Yeah. So
I'm writing a story about Africa, and I think in Nigeria the vaccination is 4%, and they said that the vaccines they get they're so old that they only have a month left before they can give them, and the distribution systems there are much. Yeah.
Well, you look at Moderna and Pfizer, both did miracle work. And in Moderna's case, with the government helping them with the taxpayers helping them every single step of the way. But basically, on the whole, they're selling their vaccines to countries that can afford them. There's big profit to be made.
Yeah, there is. So, as a historian, you look at this, and do you think vaccine hesitancy is here to stay? And also the mistrust of scientists. I mean, I've spoken to scientists about this, and they say, well, the anti-science movement is, people are selective, and people still want their rocket ships to be built by rocket scientists. They want a pilot flying their plane, not a monkey.
Exactly.
They want their elevators inspected, so they're not totally anti-science.
Exactly. This is like an exaggerated case of people who didn't want seatbelts,
Yeah.
But I think that as we start to have these incredible mRNA breakthroughs with other diseases, including cancers, I think there's a great chance to sort of get a lot of the hesitancy over with. The one thing I will say, I just read a little piece of an article today that said vaccinations across the board are down, not just COVID. And that's good.
Dr. Moore, he's saying he thinks that there's going to be less children getting the basic vaccinations they need.
It's very possible.
I want to talk about masks, because that's been a great sense of argument, and so you have the blue states now lifting their masks, mandates, and because I think it's basically political. The election midterms are coming.
Oh yeah.
So Are masks, I mean, I think, next flu season, I might wear a mask.
It was really interesting. I had a class of 20 undergraduates at NYU, and I asked them, will you continue wearing masks when this ends? And the consensus seemed to be, on an airplane, yes. On the subways, yes. In other words, it will be worn more selectively.
Okay.
It used to be seen, as you know, David, to wear it on a plane was almost an antisocial act until this came about. But I think selectively, people are going to be wearing masks for a long. I'm going to wear a mask on a plane and on a subway a year from now.
5 years ago, I was in Colorado and I was flying back, and there was a woman from China who was wearing a mask. The only person wearing a mask, but she wouldn't put her seatbelt on. and the pilot said, they found someone who spoke Chinese, and she said she doesn't believe in seatbelts and afraid of them, and so she got escorted off the plane. But that is very interesting. Very interesting. So I think we reached our allotted hours. Before I ask a final question. Thursday, February 24th, I'm going to be speaking to Dr. Evian Gordon, who's going to discuss the fact that most antidepressant drugs don't work that well, maybe 50% of the time. And he's coming up with other ways to, he feels that we're going about it different, incorrectly, and he's studying the whole brain, and that he's going to talk about some of the drugs he wants to develop. And then on Wednesday, March 2nd, I was speaking to Gideon Gill, who is the managing editor of STAT. And he was on our show before, and he helped to produce a new documentary called Augmented, which will debut on Nova February 23rd. And this is about a man who had both of his legs amputated and has bionic legs, and actually now designs them. So that's what's coming up. So Dr. Oshinsky, thank you for being on the program.
It's my pleasure. I had a lot of fun.
Let me see if there's one more question.
Sure.
Okay, so someone said, which we know, that we've had a handful of people who've been cured of HIV. There's a first woman, yeah.
I saw that. Yeah.
So
that is, it's only the third person, I think, with tens of millions living with it, but that will be investigated. If what that leads to could be monumental. Who knows? It's so early right now, and we really don't know the facts of the case, but it's fascinating. It is absolutely fascinating.
Okay, so if there are no final questions, I'm going to say goodnight to people, let you go about your business. Thank you. It's a pleasure. The first Pulitzer Prize winner I've interviewed. So that's been great in these last 2 years, and we'll see you next week. Everyone stay safe and don't get sick.
Thanks. Okay, David, take care.
Good night.